High up in the icy wilderness of the Swiss Alps, seasoned climber Lucas Meyer was navigating the perilous heights alone when a brilliant, otherworldly light burst through the dense mountain fog. He froze in awe as a sleek, metallic object hovered silently above the jagged peaks. Suddenly, a deafening hum filled the air, and the object vanished into thin air. What Lucas discovered afterward, a trail of scorched snow and strange symbols etched into the rock, would unravel a mystery beyond human comprehension. Lucas Meyer had spent his life chasing heights, both metaphorical and literal. A veteran climber with over a decade of experience, Lucas had scaled some of the world's most formidable peaks. To him, the Swiss Alps were not just another challenge. They were the crown jewel of Europe's mountain ranges. While many climbers focused on famous summits like the Matterhorn, Lucas was drawn to an uncharted peak he discovered in an obscure climber's journal, a place shrouded in mystery, its very location often debated among the climbing community. At the base of the climb, the jagged mountains loomed like silent sentinels. The sun was beginning to rise, casting golden light over the snow-covered expanse. The crisp air bit at his skin as Lucas tightened his harness and checked his gear: ice axe, crampons, ropes, carabiners. His preparation was meticulous, but something about this expedition felt different, heavier. The mountain seemed alive, pulsating with an energy that prickled the back of his neck as if it were watching him. As he ascended, the world below shrank into a quilt of alpine meadows and glacial cliffs. The wind howled through the narrow passages, carrying an eerie resonance that made him pause. He dismissed it as the natural sounds of the mountains, though it left a knot of unease in his chest. About 6 hours in, he faced his first major obstacle, a precarious ice overhang. Hoisting himself up with calculated precision, Lucas marveled at the desolate beauty around him. It was breathtaking and isolating, a stark reminder of how small he was in the face of nature's vastness. But as the day wore on, the climb grew stranger. His radio, a lifeline to his base team, began emitting static. Adjusting it yielded nothing but crackling, and then, just for a moment, a low, rhythmic hum, like a distant chant. Lucas froze, gripping the ice wall as his pulse quickened. The sound faded as quickly as it had come, leaving him questioning whether it had been real. The sky above had changed by the time Lucas reached a narrow plateau to rest. The deep metallic gray shimmered unnaturally, casting an otherworldly hue over the landscape. The air felt heavier, charged as though a storm was brewing, though there was no sign of clouds. His unease deepened. Something about this mountain felt wrong, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. When he reached his campsite for the night, Lucas set up his tent on a flat patch of snow and prepared a simple meal. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows stretched unnaturally long in the dim light of his headlamp. The wind's howl seemed to carry whispers, faint but unsettling. He scanned the darkness outside his tent, but nothing stirred. He told himself it was just his imagination, the result of exhaustion and isolation. Morning brought fresh dread. Outside his tent, the snow had been disturbed. Tracks trailed off into the distance, elongated, with circular impressions at the center. They were unlike any human or animal tracks Lucas had seen. His breath caught as he realized they led higher up the mountain, in the direction he was headed. Ignoring the gnawing fear in his gut, he packed up his gear and pressed onward. As he climbed, the rhythmic hum returned, louder and more distinct. It was no longer coming from the radio, but from the mountain itself. The metallic taste in the air grew stronger, coating his tongue and making him nauseous. Each step felt heavier, as though the mountain were testing his resolve. Then it happened. Reaching a ridge, Lucas saw a flash of light in his peripheral vision. He turned to see a glowing, disc-shaped object hovering silently above the peaks. The craft was sleek, its surface reflecting the dim light of the overcast sky. Pulsating bands of color ran along its edges in a mesmerizing pattern. Despite its size, it made no sound. The silence was deafening, broken only by the erratic pounding of Lucas's heart. He stood frozen, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. The craft remained still for several seconds before shooting upward at an impossible speed, vanishing into the clouds. The sudden absence of its presence left the air unnaturally still. Lucas forced himself to move, cautiously approaching the spot where the craft had hovered. The snow was scorched, revealing the bare rock beneath. Kneeling down, he noticed something etched into the stone. Glowing symbols, intricate and alien. They seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. His hands trembled as he sketched them into his notebook, compelled by a mix of fear and fascination. Each symbol felt significant, as if it held answers he wasn't yet ready to understand. He couldn't shake the feeling that the mountain had chosen him, that this encounter wasn't random. Lucas packed his belongings with trembling hands, determined to press forward but haunted by the symbols and the craft. He had come seeking a mountain to conquer, but what he found was something far beyond the reach of human understanding, and deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that the mountain was alive. Each step upward seemed to pull him deeper into an otherworldly mystery. The symbols he had sketched replayed in his mind, their glowing patterns a haunting reminder of what he had seen. He tried to rationalize it, ancient carvings perhaps, but their pulsing light, almost alive, defied explanation. He wasn't just climbing a mountain anymore, he was venturing into the unknown. The hum that had begun as a faint vibration now grew louder, a low frequency resonating in his very bones. He told himself it could be natural, maybe the sound of shifting glaciers, but the mountain's eerie silence contradicted him. This sound wasn't random. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like the heartbeat of something colossal and unseen. By mid-afternoon, Lucas reached a narrow passage flanked by towering ice walls. The path was barely wide enough to cross without risking a fatal slip into the abyss below. As he moved cautiously, he noticed something strange about the ice. It wasn't just clear, it was polished, reflective like glass. His own image stared back at him with unsettling precision. As he glanced around, something flickered in the corner of his eye. Movement. He whipped around, but the path behind him was empty. He pressed forward, each step heavier than the last. He reached a plateau offering a breathtaking view of the peaks. As he caught his breath and drank from his water bottle, a faint, shimmering light in the distance caught his attention. It wasn't the sun reflecting off ice, it moved deliberately, hovering just above the horizon. Lucas grabbed his binoculars, his pulse quickening. Through his binoculars the image sharpened. Another craft, smaller and more angular than the one he had seen earlier, with a dull, metallic sheen. Unlike the pulsating colors of the first, this one was matte, almost camouflaged against the mountains. It hovered silently, then descended behind a distant ridge, disappearing from view. Lucas hesitated. The rational part of his mind urged caution. He was far off his planned route. The terrain was growing more dangerous, and night was approaching. But another part of him, driven by insatiable curiosity, couldn't resist. Packing up his gear, he adjusted his climbing line and set off toward the ridge where the craft had disappeared. The journey was grueling. Loose rocks and deep snow made every step a gamble. The air grew colder, sharper, the metallic taste from earlier now more pronounced. Lucas began to feel as though the mountain itself was resisting him, aware of his trespass. Yet he pressed on. The closer he got to the ridge, the stranger the mountain became. The snow here was tinged with a faint otherworldly glow. The whispers returned, faint but persistent, carried on the wind like fragments of an ancient song. He couldn't understand the words, but their tone was clear, urgent, almost pleading. When he reached the ridge, the sight below stunned him. Nestled in a sheltered valley was a massive structure, its surface smooth and seamless as though carved from a single piece of black stone. It glowed faintly, its edges outlined by the same pulsing light as the symbols he had seen earlier. Surrounding it were smaller shapes, figures that moved with deliberate mechanical precision. Lucas dropped to his knees, his heart pounding. The figures weren't human. They were tall and slender, their forms shimmering as though caught between solid and light. Their movements were fluid, almost graceful, yet completely unnatural. He watched in stunned silence as they moved around the structure, their actions purposeful but incomprehensible. One of the figures stopped and turned, its gaze locking onto Lucas. He froze. The being's face, or what passed for one, was a smooth expanse of shifting light, rippling like water in the moonlight. Yet, despite its lack of features, Lucas felt its gaze pierce him, exposing every thought, every memory, every fear. Time seemed to stretch infinitely as he remained locked in its stare. Then, just as suddenly, the figure turned away, resuming its work. Lucas staggered backward, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But as he moved, he noticed something etched into the ground near the ridge. Another set of symbols, more intricate than the ones he had seen before, pulsed faintly with an inner light. They seemed alive, almost beckoning him. Compelled beyond reason, Lucas reached out to touch the symbols. The moment his fingers brushed the stone, a shock ran through his body. Not painful, but overwhelming. Images flooded his mind. Galaxies, swirling stars, impossible structures that defied logic. It felt as though he were being shown a glimpse of something vast and incomprehensible, a truth his mind could barely grasp. When he came to, the valley below was empty. The figures were gone, the craft vanished, and the symbols had faded into the rock, their light extinguished. The only sound was the howling wind, as though the mountain itself were exhaling a long-held breath. Lucas clutched his notebook tightly, his hands trembling as he tried to process what he had just experienced. The mountain was no longer just a challenge to conquer. It was a doorway to something far greater and far more terrifying than he had ever imagined. And Lucas, whether by fate or accident, had been chosen to step through it. Lucas descended the ridge in a daze, his mind reeling from what he had witnessed. The valley, the figures, the symbols, they were seared into his memory, impossible to ignore. The weight of it bore down on him, his steps faltering as he struggled to make sense of what had happened. For years he had believed in the power of mountains to humble a person, but this was different. He no longer felt like a climber. He felt like an intruder, trespassing on something far beyond his understanding. As the whispers faded, replaced by the howl of the wind, Lucas noticed something else. He wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched returned, sharper and more oppressive than before. He scanned the barren peaks, his pulse quickening. Shadows shifted in the periphery of his vision, darting just out of sight. Logic told him it was nothing, a trick of the light. But logic was fragile on this mountain, where reality itself seemed to bend. By the time he reached a gorge leading back to his planned route, the strange sensations had only intensified. The air felt heavier, pressing down like an unseen weight. Then he heard it, a faint metallic clinking, like chains rattling against stone. He froze. The sound grew louder, echoing off the ice walls. He spun around, scanning the path behind him. At first, there was nothing but wind-whipping snow through the air. Then he saw it. Movement in the distance. A figure, cloaked in black, standing perfectly still against the snow. Lucas's breath caught. The figure wasn't like the ones he had seen in the valley. It was humanoid, distinctly human. Yet something felt wrong. It didn't move. It didn't even seem alive. Summoning courage, Lucas called out, his voice cracking. "Who's there?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it glided forward, its movements smooth, as though floating above the snow. Panic surged through Lucas. He turned to run, slipping on the icy ground. Scrambling to his feet, he risked a glance over his shoulder. The figure was gone, vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. The rest of the descent was a blur. Lucas moved quickly, his mind racing with fear and confusion. He didn't stop until he reached a sheltered outcropping where he could rest. Pulling his notebook from his pack, he flipped through the sketches of the symbols. They seemed different now, as though they had shifted, their patterns more fragmented and chaotic. The symbols felt alive, their shapes pulsating faintly under his headlamp. Lucas's breath quickened as he realized they weren't just messages. They were a map leading deeper into the mountain. The decision was made for him when the metallic hum returned, louder this time, reverberating through the ground. The sound was almost deafening, a low vibration pulling him toward it. Clutching his notebook, Lucas packed his gear and set off again, fear overshadowed by compulsion. The path grew treacherous, winding through narrow chasms and steep inclines. The symbols seemed to guide him, appearing faintly on rocks and ice like breadcrumbs. Lucas followed them without hesitation, his thoughts swirling with fear and determination. Hours passed as he climbed higher and deeper into the mountain. The terrain grew more alien. The snow turned iridescent, shimmering in faint light. The air buzzed with an energy that made his skin crawl. Lucas's breath came in short gasps, each one visible in the freezing air. Finally, he reached a massive archway carved into the mountain. Its edges glowed with the same pulsating light as the symbols. Standing before it, Lucas felt both awe and terror. This was it, the source of the hum, the place the symbols had led him to. As he approached, the light grew brighter and the hum intensified. Lucas hesitated, instincts screaming at him to turn back. But something beyond fear drove him forward. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the archway. The moment his fingers made contact, the world around him changed. The light engulfed him, blinding and overwhelming. Lucas felt weightless, floating in a void. Shapes and colors swirled around him, impossible geometries defying comprehension. His mind stretched, straining to grasp the magnitude of what he was seeing. Then, suddenly, it was over. Lucas collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The archway loomed above him, unchanged, but something inside him was different. He felt it, a connection, a fragment of understanding he couldn't put into words. The mountain had shown him something, but the meaning remained out of reach. As Lucas sat there, a new sound filled the air. It wasn't the hum. It was a voice, low and resonant. It spoke in a language he didn't recognize but somehow understood. "You are not ready." The words echoed in his mind, leaving him shaken. Whatever this place was, whatever the mountain held, Lucas realized it wasn't meant for him. Not yet. Gathering his strength, he stood and began the long descent, the mountain's secrets heavy on his shoulders. The descent stretched before Lucas like an endless trial. Every step away from the ridge, from the alien archway, felt heavier, as though the mountain itself was reluctant to let him leave. The voice, "You are not ready," echoed in his mind, a cryptic warning that unsettled him. His legs trembled under the weight of his pack and the overwhelming burden of what he had seen. The air was thinner, colder, charged with tension that seeped into his very bones. Lucas's thoughts raced. What had he stumbled upon? Was the mountain a doorway to something otherworldly? The symbols, the figures, the craft, they felt like fragments of a vast, incomprehensible puzzle. A part of him wanted to turn back, to find answers, but another part screamed to escape while he still could. As the sun dipped lower, casting the peaks in shadow, Lucas retraced the treacherous paths he had climbed earlier. The snow glowed faintly, its eerie iridescence a reminder that he was leaving a place unlike any other. The metallic hum had faded, but the oppressive silence that followed was worse. Pausing to catch his breath on a narrow ledge, Lucas scanned the horizon. For the first time in hours, he felt a faint glimmer of relief. There was no sign of the cloaked figure, no shifting shadows. Perhaps whatever had been following him had stayed behind. He was wrong. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a dark shape perched on a ridge above him. It wasn't the cloaked figure this time. It was smaller, humanoid, but its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its stillness was almost worse than if it had moved. It was watching him. A chill ran down Lucas's spine. He wanted to look away, but his body refused to move. His breath caught as the figure's head jerked sharply, its gaze locking onto his. And then, it moved. The thing descended the ridge with unsettling fluidity, its elongated limbs carrying it forward in jerky, unnatural strides. Lucas's instincts kicked in, and he bolted down the path, his boots slipping on the icy ground. The sound of its pursuit was maddening, a series of clicks and scratches, the rhythm erratic. Lucas didn't dare look back. Ahead, he spotted an overhang, a shallow cave carved into the rock. Without thinking, he dove inside, pressing himself against the cold stone. Switching off his headlamp, he plunged into darkness, holding his breath as he listened. The clicking sounds grew louder, closer. Lucas clutched his ice axe tightly, though he doubted it would do much good. Then, the sounds stopped. Silence. Lucas strained his ears, listening for movement. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Slowly, he allowed himself to exhale. Perhaps the thing had lost interest. He was wrong again. A guttural noise, half growl, half screech, pierced the air. Lucas realized the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was above him. He looked up just as a dark shape descended from the ceiling, its limbs stretching toward him. Instinct took over. Lucas swung his ice axe with all his strength. The blade connected with a sickening crunch, and the creature let out a shrill, otherworldly shriek. Knocked backward by the force, Lucas scrambled to his feet, adrenaline propelling him. He didn't wait to see if the thing was still alive. He bolted out of the cave, running down the path at a reckless pace. The jagged cliffs and shimmering snow blurred around him. His mind was singularly focused on one thing: survival. Whatever had chased him was not of this world. It didn't belong here, and neither did he. By the time Lucas reached a wider path, his lungs burned, and his legs felt like lead. Collapsing to his knees in the snow, he gasped for air, his hands trembling. He was alive, but for how much longer? Looking up, Lucas realized the mountain had changed again. The iridescent glow was gone, replaced by a deep darkness. The peaks loomed like shadowy giants, barely visible against the starless sky. The oppressive silence returned, pressing on his ears like a physical force. The mountain wasn't letting him go. It was leading him somewhere else. Ahead, the faint outline of another structure came into view. It wasn't like the archway. This one was smaller, its surface jagged and uneven. Symbols were etched into its surface, glowing faintly like the ones he had seen before. The sight sent a fresh wave of dread through him, but he couldn't stop. Something pulled him forward, an unseen force drawing him closer. As Lucas approached, the air grew heavier, vibrating faintly with a low-frequency hum. He reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing against the cold surface of the structure. The moment he made contact, his vision swam. Images flooded his mind, stars collapsing into voids, cities of impossible geometry, and beings that defied the limits of human understanding. When he snapped back to reality, Lucas stumbled backward, his breath ragged. Whatever the structure was, it wasn't meant for him. Yet, deep down, he knew it was connected to everything else. The craft, the symbols, the figures. The mountain wasn't just a place. It was a gate, a threshold to something far greater and far more dangerous than he could comprehend. Gathering his strength, Lucas forced himself to stand. The path stretched endlessly before him, dark and foreboding, but he had no choice. The mountain wasn't done with him yet. Lucas pressed on, each step feeling like an act of defiance against the mountain itself. The biting wind howled around him, carrying faint whispers that seemed to crawl under his skin. The glow of the structure behind him faded as he moved forward, swallowed by the inky darkness. His headlamp cast a narrow cone of light, barely illuminating the jagged trail ahead. The silence was suffocating, amplifying the sound of Lucas's breathing and the crunch of his boots in the snow. Every instinct told him to stop, to turn back, but the pull of the mountain was relentless. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time had lost all meaning. The path grew narrower, winding along the edge of a cliff that plunged into darkness. The stars above were obscured by swirling mist, casting the landscape in unnatural gloom. Lucas paused to catch his breath, leaning against a jagged outcropping of rock. His hands trembled as he reached for his water bottle. As he took a sip, a sound broke the silence. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like stone against stone. It was distant, but growing louder. Lucas froze, his heart pounding. The tapping grew closer, echoing through the narrow gorge. Slowly, he reached for his ice axe, gripping it tightly as his eyes scanned the darkness. The mist obscured everything beyond a few feet, but the sound was relentless. Then it stopped. The silence was absolute. Lucas held his breath, every muscle tensed. A shadow emerged from the mist. It was humanoid but grotesque, its limbs elongated and unnaturally thin. Its head twisted unnaturally as it moved, its gait jerky and uneven, like a marionette controlled by unseen hands. Lucas stumbled backward, his boots slipping on the icy ground. The creature let out a guttural growl, its movements quickening. Without thinking, Lucas turned and ran, his headlamp bobbing wildly as he scrambled along the narrow trail. The sound of the creature's pursuit was deafening, a cacophony of clicking and scraping. The path curved sharply, leading to a narrow bridge of ice spanning a deep chasm. Lucas hesitated before sprinting across, the fragile surface cracking under his weight. He didn't look back until he reached the other side. Turning, he saw the creature at the edge of the bridge, its head cocked as if studying him. For a brief moment it was still. Then, with a sickening crack, it began to crawl onto the ice, its limbs bending at impossible angles. Lucas watched in horror as the ice buckled under its weight. The creature let out a piercing screech as the bridge gave way, plunging into the darkness below. Lucas stood frozen, his chest heaving. From the depths of the chasm came a new sound, a low, resonant hum that made the ground beneath him vibrate. The chasm began to glow faintly, a pulsating light emanating from its depths. Shapes emerged from the light, floating, amorphous forms that defied logic. They moved with fluid grace, their edges shimmering like heat waves. One of the shapes drifted closer, its form shifting constantly, as though made of liquid light. Lucas felt an overwhelming pressure in his skull, a sensation that wasn't painful but deeply unsettling. Images flooded his mind, alien landscapes, towering structures, and beings of impossible complexity. He felt as though he were being shown a glimpse of something incomprehensible, a truth too vast for his mind. The vision ended abruptly, leaving Lucas gasping for air. The floating forms receded, sinking back into the glowing chasm. The hum faded, replaced by the oppressive silence of the mountain. Lucas staggered backward, his legs weak. Before he could collect his thoughts, the ground beneath him began to tremble. Small rocks tumbled into the abyss. A deep, rumbling sound echoed through the peaks, growing louder. Lucas turned and ran, the path ahead a blur as the mountain itself seemed to convulse. He didn't stop until he reached a sheltered alcove, collapsing against the cold rock. His entire body trembled, his breaths ragged. Whatever he had just witnessed, it was clear that the mountain was awakening, and it wasn't meant for him. As Lucas sat there, a new sound broke the silence. It wasn't the hum or the whispers. It was a voice, deep and resonant, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. But somehow, he knew the words were meant for him. The voice echoed in his mind, filling him with a strange mixture of dread and awe. The meaning was clear, even if the language was alien. The path is not yours to take. Leave while you still can. Lucas closed his eyes, the weight of the message pressing down on him. His thoughts raced. Was this his final warning, or was the mountain testing him further? He didn't know. All he knew was that this place, its power, its secrets, was alive, and he was trespassing. Gathering what little strength he had left, Lucas forced himself to stand. The path stretched endlessly before him, dark and foreboding, but he had no choice. The mountain wasn't done with him yet. The mountain loomed over Lucas, its peaks a fortress of shadow and frost. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, but he couldn't stop. The whispers returned, louder and insistent, their alien syllables echoing like fragments of a forgotten dream. Each step felt heavier than the last, the air colder, thicker, as though the mountain was suffocating him. The path wound upward, steeper with each turn. Stars vanished, swallowed by swirling mist pulsing with an otherworldly energy. Lucas's headlamp flickered, its light dimming. He clutched his ice axe, its weight a small comfort. Ahead, the path opened into a wide plateau, its surface smooth as if carved by hands far older than human. At the center stood a massive stone monolith, its surface etched with glowing symbols haunting Lucas since the climb began. The hum returned, deep and resonant, vibrating through the ground. Lucas approached cautiously, his breath visible in the freezing air. The symbols pulsated faintly, their light shifting like liquid. As he reached to touch the surface, a sharp pain shot through his skull. He staggered, clutching his head as images flooded his mind, visions of galaxies in chaos, beings of light and shadow locked in endless conflict, the mountain rising as a sentinel guarding universal secrets. The visions faded, leaving Lucas gasping. He fell to his knees, his head spinning. The whispers grew louder, shifting from warning to command. The monolith pulsed, its light intensifying until it bathed the plateau in a blinding glow. The ground trembled. Lucas scrambled as fissures spread, cracks radiating outward. The hum rose in pitch, deafening. From the cracks emerged searing light, so bright it burned even with his eyes shut. The light coalesced into a shape, vague at first, then solidifying into something defying logic. Its massive form shifted like a living storm. Tendrils of light and shadow extended, reaching toward the monolith and peaks. Lucas felt its presence, an incomprehensible vastness pressing against his consciousness. A deep voice filled the air. It spoke in the alien tongue, but Lucas understood. The meaning was clear, etched into his mind. "You have come too far. This is not your path. Turn back or be consumed." The words carried weight Lucas couldn't ignore. He wanted to flee, to run down the mountain and never look back, but his legs refused to move. The entity's gaze pinned him like an insect under glass. As the entity shifted closer, Lucas's mind raced. Every instinct screamed to leave, but a quieter voice urged him to stay. He had come so far, seen so much. Perhaps this was why the mountain had called him, why it let him survive. Summoning what courage he had left, Lucas took a step forward. The entity paused, its tendrils recoiling slightly. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and chaotic, but Lucas pushed them aside. He raised his ice axe, not as a weapon, but as resolve. "I'm not leaving," he said, trembling but firm. "Not until I understand." The entity's form shifted, tendrils weaving into a singular shape. The light dimmed, leaving a faint glow outlining its massive form. The hum softened, becoming a vibration resonating deep in Lucas's chest. For a moment, the mountain was silent. Then the entity spoke. "To understand is to lose yourself. Are you willing to pay the price?" Lucas hesitated. The weight of the question pressed on him. He thought of others who had climbed this mountain, the stories of those who disappeared. Had they faced the same choice? "I don't know," he admitted, "but I can't turn back. Not now." The entity considered his words. The silence stretched, each second an eternity. Finally, it extended a tendril, glowing inches from Lucas's chest. The whispers returned, softer now, almost gentle. Then, step forward and know the truth. Lucas closed his eyes and stepped into the light. The world dissolved. The mountain, cold, and darkness, all vanished. Lucas floated in a void, surrounded by stars pulsing like living beings. Shapes and colors swirled, forming patterns defying comprehension. His mind expanded, accommodating the flood of knowledge. He saw the mountain's origins, a place where dimensions converged, boundaries thin and fragile. He saw entities dwelling within it, ancient and unknowable. And he saw himself, a fragment of consciousness adrift in an infinite cosmos, insignificant but vital. When Lucas awoke, he lay on the plateau, the monolith dark and silent. The entity was gone, the mountain still. He felt different, lighter yet hollow, as if a part of him had been left behind. The path down the mountain stretched clear before him. Lucas hesitated. He had sought answers and found them, but at what cost? As he began his descent, the whispers faded, replaced by the crunch of snow under his boots. The mountain had let him go, but Lucas knew he would never truly leave it behind.